Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I had not planned to do the podcast I am about to do for a little while, but I got a very fascinating and illuminating critique from a colleague just before, and I wanted to incorporate that into this next podcast that I am doing now, as well as delve into a related subject. First, I wanted to apologize for having made a factual mistake in my previous podcast. I will put on my spectacles briefly so I can read to you what this person said to me. I will not identify the persons, since the person did not say that I could. So I will just say what he wrote to me. He said that Israel is not better educated than Palestine, since the 18-year-olds go to the military and not university like the Palestinians do. Okay, so that is the critique, and it is an accurate and valid critique. And if I had done more checking and more preparation, I would have found that out myself. But unfortunately, I did not. So again, I wanted to thank this person, who will remain anonymous unless he says that I can use his name, for providing that critique for me. And again, I apologize for the misinformation, and hopefully that corrects it. Let me tell you what I wrote in response. What I said is, thank you. I should have done more checking before I did the podcast. In terms of class, what I was trying to convey is that class is the substructure for race and gender. Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins, on the other hand, regard race, class, and gender as co-equal independent variables. That means like causal factors. That is a common Marxist critique, which I share, of intersectionality. Ashley Bower's intersectional Marxism and Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza's Kyriarchy, which I left for a future podcast. That future podcast is the one I will be doing now, place Marxism into intersectionality. And so that was my response to what that individual said to me. And again, once again, apologies for getting that factual error into the podcast, and for not doing more thorough checking in advance. If I did, I would have seen that for myself, but regrettably, I did not do that. So again, apologies and thank you to the individual who made that correction for me. Now, what I will do, as I said here, is I will get into the subject of Kyriarchy as developed by Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza. Interestingly, my old best friend, his last name was also Fiorenza, and so I know from him that the Italian name Fiorenza means little flower. So it's Elizabeth Schuster Little Flower. Well, Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza. And she developed Kyriarchy as a type of intersectionality, or I guess you could say a variation or expansion upon intersectionality, but one which is essentially Marxist. I guess it could be used in other areas as well, but my reading of her work, and I will be sharing some of that with you in this podcast, which is why I have kept my spectacles on, will be a Marxist one, um, while not attempting to leave out any other possible readings of her work. This is taken from my book, which I will, which actually is already included in the comments section of the podcast directly below the video. And the link there is to Eudaimonic Utopia, and that is where I'm going to be reading from. So you can go and find this for yourself if you want in this book. It is a work in progress. By work in progress, I mean I will keep on working on it until I get tired and go on to something else. But it is a work in progress as of now. I guess because I like writing it. I mean, pretty much I will just keep on writing books until I get tired of writing them and decide to start writing something else. My next project will be a work in phenomenology, the phenomenology that was developed by Edmund Husserl, and it will be an attempt to apply phenomenology to the work of Roy Bhaskar's critical realism. Okay, here's what I wrote. This is the introduction to chapter 5 of this book, which is titled Kyriarchy. Kyriarchy, as formulated by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, is an expansion of intersectionality and intersectional Marxism to consider intersections going beyond the more traditional race, gender, and so forth. Note that I left out class. That was intentional because I do not regard class as being an intersection, so that was writer's privilege. As such, imperialism, colonialism, and hegemony are in Kyriarchy additional intersectional thoroughfares. The application of intersectional Marxism to socialism from below third worldism, or Maoism third worldism, has broadened. At our disposal is a thoroughgoing model or blueprint for human societies, a framework with further intersectional social structures, vastly transcending that which seems to have been initially anticipated by Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, and others, is made feasible. Race and gender, while important societal thoroughfares or intersections, are insufficient for appreciating the many economic and political components which remain requisite for any comprehensive social scientific and scientific socialist formulation. Kyriarchy might add to intersectional Marxism or social class a focus on both the first world and the third world, with the array of political entities contained inside each of them. This intersectional map incorporates macro sociological structures converging at various differential points of inequality. Now, let me go back and explain a couple of things that I mentioned in there, the terminology, so it's clear. First, imperialism. Imperialism comes from the same root as empire, and so imperialism is building an empire, which is something that the US has done a very good job of, and before the US, other countries did reasonably good jobs of it, sometimes very good jobs of it as well. Colonialism is the process of creating colonies. The US does not have that many colonies. Britain, France, Portugal, and so on, in the past had many colonies, actually called colonies, which basically are countries or properties of a country that do not have all of the same civil rights as the actual country do. Many people, for example, think of Puerto Rico as being a colony. It has some features of a colony, but actually it is a dependency. So technically, Puerto Rico, while similar to a colony, is not precisely the same as a colony. Hegemony, a term which was made popular by Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony. Hegemony refers to dominance. It can be any kind of dominance, especially the dominance of a state over elements of that state which are regarded as being in disagreement with it or being in conflict with it. So, for example, one might say that the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class have hegemony over the proletariat or the working class. And according to Gramsci, that cultural hegemony is one of the primary reasons there has not been a revolution in the United States, because the working class simply is prevented from developing a sufficient level of class consciousness in order to engage in revolution. Plus, I would argue that the reason for the lumpen proletariat, which is the working class minus any or almost any class consciousness, is a direct result of cultural hegemony as well. If it were not for cultural hegemony, for example, one would not have the MAGA movement. I would say that the MAGA movement is a direct result of cultural hegemony. The fact that you have these workers who are victimized by the capitalist state, are actually in support of it, support capitalism, support Donald Trump, a capitalist, is a very clear indication of a lack of class consciousness, or as Paulo Freire would call it, conscientization, the process of developing class consciousness and class conscience. Okay. Next, I'll mention another factor, the concept of the first world and the third world, as I say, with the array of political entities contained inside each of them. By political entities contained inside each of them, I am talking primarily of countries. So, for example, the US, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand would all be political entities or countries contained within the first world. Likewise, Palestine, Haiti, India, Pakistan, and so forth would be political entities contained within the third world. By macro sociological structures, in sociology, we make a distinction between macro sociology and micro sociology. Macro sociology is a type of sociology which focuses primarily on societies or large-scale social structures, basically social entities or groups in which people do not necessarily know or have contact with all members of that particular social entity. So even in my own town of Mission, Texas, I could call that a macro sociological structure. Why? Because I do not know everyone here in Mission. I don't. I wish I did, but I don't. And so that would be macro sociological. But a small group, like when I was teaching classes, each of those classes, which typically had no more than 40 people in them, would be considered to be a micro sociological structure. So that's basically what I mean by each of those terms in that introductory paragraph. Now, what I will do here is I will read for you a few different quotations. The first one is actually by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and the others are by other people. I think that together they present a very good picture of what Kyriarchy is and how it works. So this begins the quotation by Fiorenza. I have proposed to replace the category of hierarchy with the neologism, which is a coined term, Kyriarchy, which is derived from the Greek words Kyrios, which means Lord, slave, master, father, husband, elite propertied educated man, and archean, to rule or to dominate. In classical antiquity, the rule of the emperor, lord, slave master, husband, or the elite freeborn, meaning non-slave, propertied, educated gentlemen, to whom disenfranchised men and women were subordinated, is best characterized as Kyriarchy. In antiquity, the social system of Kyriarchy was institutionalized either in empire, so there you get into the concept of imperialism, or as a democratic political form of ruling. Kyriarchy is best theorized as a complex pyramidal system of intersecting multiplicative social and religious structures of superordination and subordination, of ruling and oppression. Kyriarchal relations of domination are built on elite male property rights as well as on the exploitation, dependency, inferiority, and obedience of the way that she writes it here is WO/MEN, who signify all those subordinated. Such kyriarchal relations are still today at work in the multiplicative intersectionality of class, race, gender, ethnicity, empire, and other structures of domination. Kyriarchy is constituted as a socio-cultural and religious system of dominations by intersecting multiplicative structures of oppression. The different sets of relations of domination shift historically and produce a different constellation or arrangement of oppression in different times and cultures. The structural positions of subordination that have been fashioned by kyriarchal relations stand in tension with those required by radical democracy. A critical intersectional analytic does not understand kyriarchy as an essentialist ahistorical system. Instead, it articulates kyriarchy as a heuristic derived from the Greek meaning to find concept, or as a diagnostic instrument that enables investigation into the multiplicative interdependence of gender, race, class, and imperial stratifications, as well as into their discursive inscriptions and ideological reproductions. I realize that was a difficult section of her book to read without you seeing it, but essentially she is defining kyriarchy as an expansion of intersectionality to include political intersectionality. Basically, intersectionality, as it was originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and later modified by Patricia Hill Collins, was a feminist concept originally. In fact, intersectionality grew out of Black feminism. It was literally an outgrowth of Black feminism. And then class and race were incorporated into it. What she is doing is expanding the concept of intersectionality to include aspects, I guess you could say intersections, which are other than race and gender. So she is taking one step beyond what Collins and Crenshaw did. And I think that is definitely an improvement upon the intersectionality that was developed by Crenshaw and Collins. And she also relates it to the notion of hierarchy, but she says that her understanding of hierarchy is much more nuanced. And that's why she attempts to explain all of these different forms. So, although obviously, for example, if you are talking about imperialism, you do have a kind of hierarchy. The imperialist nations and those countries which are dominated by it exist in a hierarchy. But I think that what she is saying is that that hierarchy is better approached as a kind of Kyriarchy, which is kind of a paternalistic idea. The fact that the root is lord, slave master, father, husband, elite, propertied, educated man does give a certain level of paternalism to the notion of Kyriarchy, which is not necessarily present in the concept of hierarchy. So hopefully that is somewhat clear. And now I will move on to the next excerpt from an article. This is by Natalie Osborne, and it is taken from a section of an article that she wrote called Intersectionality and Kyriarchy, a framework for approaching power and social justice in planning and climate change adaptation. It is taken from Planning Theory, Volume 14, Number 2, in 2015. Here is the excerpt. There are a number of benefits to employing intersectionality and Kyriarchy together as an integrated framework. The immediate benefit to integrating intersectionality and Kyriarchy is for the conceptual clarity the two offer when used together. Kyriarchy describes a multifaceted power structure and allows us to understand power as a function of multiple axes of identity and privilege, rather than focusing on one, for example, gender, patriarchy, or race, which is inadequate for understanding the complexity of lived experience. Simply put, Kyriarchy describes the power structures which intersectionality creates. In turn, Kyriarchy creates intersectional identities and lived experiences determined by multiple, sometimes conflicting, axes of identity, where patriarchy is understood as the force shaping and perpetuating gendered oppression. Kyriarchy is understood as the structure shaping intersectional oppression. Ergo, for a conceptual framework to comprehensively and clearly incorporate an understanding of the multifaceted nature of privilege and marginality, both are best employed. An integrated framework also improves our capacity to examine individual experiences of marginality and vulnerability within the context of structural power. An intersectional study that draws from Kyriarchy to establish its theory of structural power can demonstrate how intersectional identities and, in turn, lived experiences are produced and experienced through Kyriarchy. A Kyriarchal study may draw on intersectionality in order to understand how the experiences of this structural power are shaped by the intersection of identity groups at the individual level. Kyriarchy does not conflate or collapse all structures of oppression into a single, undifferentiated structure. Different structures can have distinct functions that shape how they operate, and although the structures interact, share similarities, and co-constitute each other, meaning they bring each other into being, at times it is prudent to engage in strategic essentialism, meaning regarding each one of those structures as an essence for purposes of strategy to accomplish something. Colonialism operates quite differently to heterosexism, commonly called homophobia, as one example. And so it can be useful to foreground a particular axis when seeking to understand how it functions and is perpetuated. Okay, so in that particular section of the article, the point that is being made, I think, is at least as I understand it, is that this author is making a distinction between intersectionality and Kyriarchy, whereas I might be more inclined to see Kyriarchy as a type of intersectionality. That's fine. We can all have our own way of explaining it. But since Kyriarchy developed out of intersectionality, I would see it as an application or as a modification of intersectionality, whereas Natalie Osborne sees it as a different perspective, but one which can be used in a complementary sense with intersectionality. And if you will please excuse me for a moment while I take some of this cola, because my mouth is drying out because of my meds. Again, apologies for that. I wish I didn't have to do that, but so be it. That's me. I'm an autistic guy, and I have to deal with some things that many other people would not have to deal with. Okay, this next excerpt is written by Nathan Dawthorne, and it is from an article called Reconsidering Kyriarchy. It is taken from the Journal for the Anthropology of North America, volume 221, April 2019. Here is the excerpt. Kimberly Crenshaw and Bell Hooks, among other feminists of color, have helped shape the social sciences by calling out how a singular and exclusive focus on the oppression of women replicates colonial discourses that silence marginal and dissenting voices. The concept of intersectionality helped illustrate how Black women do not have the same experiences as white women nor Black men, both groups who had established activist organizations. As a person occupies many social locations, the intersection of these culminates into an experience greater than the sum of its parts. These standpoints make politics based on one identity inadequate as they ignore other forms of oppression. Some of these axes include race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, gender identity, expression or conformity, relationship, ability, body type or size, and age. Expanding on this is Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination, which looks at the overall structure of power in society and attempts to move beyond Black and white thinking, accounting for shades of gray, nuance, context, and the non-hierarchical. To help address issues of dominance and subordination between women, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza developed the idea of Kyriarchy to move away from patriarchy as an analytical tool to recognize complex systems of oppression and privilege that shape experiences. Okay, now let me go back and clarify a couple of the points made in that excerpt that I just read. What he says here is that the concept of intersectionality helped address how Black women do not have the same experiences as white women nor Black men, and so forth. When I was still working before I retired about a year and a half ago, I used to point out to my students how when the women's liberation movement started in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and especially the organization, the NOW, the National Organization for Women, they looked around and they saw, where are the Black women? Where are the Black women? There are no Black women, or almost no Black women around. And they began to wonder why that was. Why is it that we are primarily attracting white women to our women's liberation meetings? And later it became apparent that there was a very definite reason for that. And that definite reason is this, namely, that the experiences of white women involve primarily feminism, meaning white women feel oppressed by patriarchy primarily, and sometimes exclusively, especially if you are talking about a wealthy white woman. It is patriarchy, which is the dominating principle, and nothing else, or little else. And so the meetings of, for example, of the NOW, or now, focused almost exclusively on issues of feminism, on issues of the oppression of women. Many Black women looked at the NOW and said, well, look, to us, you can't separate feminism from racism. To us, the two are really combined into one. It is because of the existence of racism, for example, that many Black men are unable to find jobs, or good jobs, which puts many women into positions of both being mothers and having a career outside the home. So the notion of feminism disconnected from racism simply makes no sense to many Black women. And for that reason, they were not attracted to the NOW and other organizations that focused on feminism. In other words, as feminism developed, it really was white feminism. So what happened? Well, a new type of feminism was formulated called womanism. And sometimes womanism was spelled WOMYNISM, basically taking the man, out of feminism, and or out of womanism. Let me take some more cola. Perhaps, as you can tell, my mouth is drying out. Pardon me. And so what they were doing, again, is they were taking the man out of womanism, and I guess conceivably out of feminism too. I've seen some spellings of feminism which have tried to distort the spelling a bit to make it look somewhat unique, but especially woman and womanism. And commonly, many feminists will spell the word woman itself as WOMYN, especially Black feminists, but not exclusively Black feminists. Now, these days, the term womanism is occasionally used, but not used all that frequently. What has replaced it is Black feminism, and even more so, perhaps, intersectionality, since intersectionality is really an expansion of feminism, Black feminism, to encompass other areas of oppression. So, really, in a sense, intersectionality is womanism, a recognition that it is not only patriarchy which oppresses Black women, it is also other things. It is also racism, as well as other factors which oppress Black women. And so that is the one of the bases for intersectionality. So literally, intersectionality is a kind of fine-tuning of womanism. Now, intersectional Marxism, not exactly, because intersectional Marxism takes the notion of womanism, later as intersectionality, and gives it a specifically Marxian focus, something which was neither a part of womanism nor intersectionality, except when used by certain authors, but it was not an inherent part of those perspectives. Next thing I wanted to mention in connection with this article is it refers to the concept of the matrix of domination, a term coined by Patricia Hill Collins. I once served on a panel with Patty. It was at a sociology conference. In fact, the two of us were seated right next to each other. At that time, Patty was not that well known, but we each read papers. It was a paper session. So we each read papers on that panel. We really didn't have a chance to talk. I would have liked to talk with her because I knew who she was. I don't think anybody else knew, but I knew who she was because I was using her book. She was not very well known yet. Later on, maybe 10 years later, roughly, she was elected president of the American Sociological Association. So then suddenly intersectionality became a big thing. But when I met her, or at least sat next to her at that conference, nobody knew what intersectionality was, or almost nobody knew what it was. Now, Patty's concept of the matrix of domination is this. Namely, well, matrix is like a birthplace, like a womb, kind of, right? So basically, matrix of domination asks, what is the womb or wombs of domination? Where does domination come from? And so to Patty, there are three primary matrices of domination: race, class, and gender. As I said previously, I have a problem with including class in there, since to me, class or capitalism is intersectionality itself. It is not an intersection, it is intersectionality. So I don't fully agree with her there, but I respect her point of view. She is a brilliant woman, has written, I don't know how many books, 20 books or 30 books, and really very, very well written scholarly books. Brilliant. She has an absolutely brilliant mind and is able to piece together so many different things. When you read through her work, which I would strongly recommend you do, even though I don't entirely agree with her, so what? It's amazing just reading the way that she thinks. Um, I'm really impressed by her and always have been, even before she was well known. Okay, on to this final quotation, and I will probably mess up the pronunciation of this first man's last name. It appears to me to be an African name, so I don't know how to pronounce it. So rather than pronounce it, I will spell it. It's William Mpofu. I will leave it to you to pronounce it. I don't know how Mpofu is pronounced. With all apologies to you, sir. I wish I did, but I don't. And the other author is Melissa Stein. The article is called The Trouble with the Human, and it is a chapter contained in the book, Decolonizing the Human, Reflections from Africa on Difference and Oppression. Here is the short passage. In her concept of the Kyriarchy, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza has helpfully coined a word for the interacting, interlocking systems of domination and subordination, people on the top, people on the bottom, that inform the modern world. As a pyramidal system, the Kyriarchy includes not only sexism, racism, and heteronormativity, but also, among other things, militarism and anthropocentrism. The vaunted human has endangered the climate and sparked an ecological crisis that threatens the very existence of the human species, the animal kingdom, plant life, water, and air. The trouble of the human is therefore not only an internal human family matter, but also an external ecological crisis that has disturbed and provoked nature, making the world a dangerous place for the human and for other life forms. Now, let me go back and explain a couple of the terms that are used in that short paragraph. Heteronormativity, a concept close to heterosexism, or as it is commonly called, homophobia, but not exactly the same. What heteronormativity is, it is a statement that, generally speaking, the heterosexual way of life, whatever that is, I have no idea what the heterosexual way of life is, but if there is a heterosexual way of life, is viewed as the standard for human behavior. So all behavior is viewed as based on heterosexuality. And therefore, homosexuality is regarded or has been regarded as deviant. Fortunately, that has lessened considerably in recent years, especially with same-sex marriage, or as it is called in the US, marriage equality. Based on a Supreme Court decision, which now is threatened. There is a chance, I don't know how much of a chance, but given the makeup of the current Supreme Court, there is a chance that marriage equality may be overturned by the current Supreme Court. I really, really, really hope that does not happen. I have known a lot of people over the years who were gay and lesbian, and many of them suffered greatly in the years before marriage equality. Even now, when marriage equality is in effect, same-sex marriage relationships are in many states illegal. So it is conceivable that a person could be married to another person of the same gender in the morning, and then in the afternoon be arrested for engaging in same-sex relations. Now, practically, I'm not sure how that would work unless the police set up a spy cam in somebody's room and watched people doing whatever they do in their bedroom, which really makes no sense to me. But I suppose they might try to do something like that if they wanted to. But nonetheless, the fact that even though nationally at this time, same-sex marriage is legal in all 50 states of the United States, and of course in many other countries as well, at least in the US, same-sex relations, sexual relations, are illegal in many states. And that was not affected by the Supreme Court decision because sexual relations and marriage are two separate issues. And so it's sad, but it is something that I think that I wish more attention were given to that. I remember how much I, as well as many other people, celebrated when the Supreme Court decided in favor of marriage equality. And I am a straight man. I am not gay, and yet I have always been an ally, even since I was a little kid, believe it or not, when nobody had any idea what an ally was. I heard, I forget from who, but somebody told me about it. And I said, "Oh, well, that sounds interesting." In other words, I had nothing against it. I thought, "Wow, that sounds cool," if some people want to do that. So I was never opposed to same-sex relations. Um, so for me, it was not a big deal, and I was very happy when marriage equality was passed by the Supreme Court. But then when it was pointed out that in many parts of the US, same-sex relations are still illegal, I began to wonder whether my celebration was premature. I don't know. I mean, I guess not really, because on one level, obviously it's good that people of the same sex can get married. And practically, as I said, I think it would be difficult to enforce the law prohibiting same-sex relations. But still, in principle, knowing that you're married to someone, but that when you have sexual relations with that same person, that you are breaking the law. I mean, that uh, I would not be very happy with that because I consider myself to be a law-abiding individual. And knowing that if I were having sex with my partner that I was married to was illegal would really, really upset me. I would not be very happy with that at all. So anyway, that's something I thought that I should point out, because the term heteronormativity has much broader implications than are usually thought. It doesn't just mean that, oh yeah, now same-sex marriage is legal, so there's no problem. Heteronormativity has been solved. There's no more heteronormativity. Quite to the contrary, heteronormativity is still heteronormativity. The heterosexual is still regarded as being the standard by which other people are addressed. An example of that, there have been studies done where they will ask people to close their eyes and to visualize a married couple. Almost everyone will visualize a woman and a man. Similarly, there have been studies done which ask people to close their eyes and to visualize a person. And almost everyone will visualize a white man. A white man, not only a man, but a white man. And again, that shows that we really have a long way to go. Maybe we have come far further than I thought we would. I guess I could say that. I never expected the gay rights movement to move along as quickly as it did, because looking back at the feminist movement, it took a really long time for feminism to even begin to work, decades. And we still have some problems in the area of feminism. But in terms of heteronormativity or homosexuality, that was relatively quick. And the reason for that was because people began to say, well, look, if you believe in liberty, if you believe in freedom, then why, if a woman and a man can get married, should two men or two women not be allowed to get married as well? And it was very difficult, even for a conservative, to refute that argument. And some people have argued that is the reason why the same-sex marriage or marriage equality in the US was put into effect as quickly as it was. Okay, second point that I wanted to mention from this paragraph. Before that, let me take another sip of this cola because I can tell my mouth is beginning to dry out once again. Part of it is that my podcasts are getting longer for some reason. Well, I guess because I have a big mouth, but aside from that, my podcasts are getting longer. And so as a result, my mouth is drying out more quickly than it was in the past. Anthropocentrism. That's probably a more commonly used term than heteronormativity, but anthropocentrism means a view of the world centered on human beings. So, for example, we put the welfare of people above the welfare of dogs, or we put the welfare of people over Earth itself. That last thing that I mentioned is especially true with respect to ecology. All of the people who are fighting against laws which would otherwise protect the climate and prevent climate change. Even if many laws that are proposed were passed into law right now, there would, to my understanding, still be some aspects of the climate that are irreversibly affected. I don't know exactly what they are, but I believe that there are some islands in the South Pacific that are beginning to sink, and some have completely sunk already. That process, I don't think, can be reversed. The peninsula of Florida, similarly, by the end of the 21st century, many climatologists predict that peninsula will be entirely immersed in the Atlantic Ocean. So the line separating the Atlantic Ocean from the Gulf of Mexico, which is made by the Florida Peninsula, will simply be eliminated. There will literally be no more Florida Peninsula. The only part of Florida that would remain in that scenario would be the Florida Panhandle, like Pensacola and Tampa. And so that's really a shame. I don't know if that particular thing is exactly irreversible, but I believe that at least some parts of it are irreversible. And certainly, as we have been seeing a pickup in hurricanes, in tornadoes, and other types of historically uncharacteristic weather activity, that weather activity will continue to pick up. And I don't think that that can be fully changed. We have simply gone too far. We have passed too many deadlines, sadly. I wish that were not the case. And if you have not heard what I have said before, I am sorry to be the bringer of bad tidings, but that is my understanding. If you believe otherwise, please comment in the video and provide me with additional information. If you have good news on that, I would like to read the good news. But again, to my understanding, that is an inevitability. That is something that will happen. whether the entire Florida peninsula sinks into the ocean or only parts of it, it's irrelevant. I mean, you're talking about people, cities, towns, farms, that will simply be wiped off the face of the earth. Now, obviously, this is not going to likely occur in one fell swoop, unless there's I guess, a massive hurricane which does massive damage at one time. It will happen gradually. So it would give people a chance to move from Florida to other places, one would hope. But still, I mean, it's a real tragedy. And if you are living on an island nation, and that island nation suddenly disappears, where do you go? Where do you go? There really is no place for you to go other than to some continent, or I suppose a larger island. That has already begun happening today. I am not a geologist, and I don't have a good memory for islands, but I believe there is one island which is owned by New Zealand. It is a part of New Zealand, but it's not actually. Maybe like a colony of New Zealand. And that island can no longer support human life. And so all the people who once lived there are now living in New Zealand or someplace else. They cannot live in their indigenous land. So it is literally robbing indigenous people of their homeland. It's a shame, all these things. And, we literally have no one to blame for these problems except for ourselves. Finally, to take the issue of Kyriarchy and apply it to the Palestinians and to Israel. That is a relatively easy thing to do, but one that is also extremely painful for me to have to point out. What Kyriarchy does, as I mentioned, is it expands intersectionality to include things like imperialism, colonialism, and cultural hegemony, issues which Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins did not address. That was not their areas of specialization. In other words, they were not, for example, political scientists or political sociologists, but certainly those areas are important ones to consider in any sophisticated model of intersectionality. So I think Fiorenza has done us all a tremendous service by developing the notion of Kyriarchy. When you look at the relationship between Israel and Gaza, which has been deteriorating now for months, this horrendous situation between Israel and Gaza, and now between Israel and Iran. We don't know where either of those situations will take us, but in both cases, we have the same basic formulation. We have an imperialist country, Israel, at war with a third world country or region, whether it's Palestine or whether it is Iran. And as has been the case throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st, third world parts of the world are finding themselves increasingly threatened by the first world. And so my heart breaks for Gaza and the Gazans. My heart breaks for Iran and the Iranians. I wish I could help you. If any of you are watching this podcast, if I could, I would. But there is nothing that I know that I can do. I am not a part of what sociologist C. Wright Mills called the power elite. I don't have the ability to formulate public policy. I just don't, and I'm so sorry for that. I wish I did. Maybe if I would have known when I was starting out my career what I know now, I might have changed my area of specialization to go into one where I might have had more impact on correcting these situations so that people like yourselves would not be in such jeopardy, perhaps even in jeopardy of being nuked. So I think that the importance of Kyriarchy is tremendous, because what it does is it allows us to take this very useful concept of intersectionality, or I would say even more precisely, intersectional Marxism, and expand it to cover issues that are not simply related to race and gender, to relate it to imperialism, to cultural hegemony, and to colonialism, all of which are real issues that affect people now in the 21st century, issues which may result in the destruction of entire communities. And I do not want to see that happen. And I hope it does not. I hope that Israel chooses not to do what it appears that it is doing right now. Do I really understand it? Not entirely. I mean, maybe with Gaza, maybe. Although Gaza is not really a threat to Israel. Not really. Not given that Israel has nukes and Gaza does not. Iran is not really a threat to Israel either. Iran does not have nukes. Iran has nuclear power. The only reason why Iran is considering now the possibility, not the inevitability, just the possibility of building nuclear weapons, is because of the activities that have been recently taken by Israel. Well, of course, initially in bombing that embassy in Damascus, Syria. So Israel could have simply avoided this whole problem, this whole mess, by not doing what it is doing. But the Likud party is a far right-wing party. And so it is not surprising that Israel is doing what it is doing. What does surprise me is that most Israelis support Likud, and that the Labor Party, which is somewhat more, I wouldn't say liberal, but more moderate, has virtually no power at all. And the non-Zionist parties, I couldn't even name one. I know they exist, but they have no power, or almost no power. They really cannot do anything. They are not even an afterthought in most cases. So it is a real tragedy for places like Gaza and for places like Iran. And for that reason, once again, I think that Kyriarchy is an important subject for us to consider and to incorporate into our understanding of intersectional Marxism. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.